Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and today we're talking about the final class archetype for War of Immortals, and probably the last video I'm going to be doing for War of Immortals for a little bit. At least I might have like an afterword. You know what? I'll talk about this at the end of the video for anyone who is truly curious. But yeah, the Avenger is the one we're talking about today, and it is a much more of a fightery style of rogue. You use your deity's favored weapon to give divine justice with all kinds of unique abilities, kind of centered around dealing a lot of damage and kind of being focused on killing divine casters or divine characters more specifically. It's very interesting, very specific, but one I think a lot of people are going to really like. But before we get into the video, I have to let you know that Paizo did send me a copy of War of Immortals for the sake of review, but they did not pay for this content. So all thoughts and opinions here are my own. For all these videos, the only thing they have ever done for me is just send me the book. So, you know. That being said, let's go ahead and talk about the Avenger. So the Avenger is very interesting, with some of its core features really allowing the rogue to get a wider use of weapons, essentially, and have a lot more of a divine assassin, kind of like almost like an Assassin's Creed kind of vibe, only more martially, using up to medium armor and the like. It's very interesting. And it's of the class archetypes from this book, it's one of the ones I'm probably the least interested overall personally, but I do think it's genuinely good, and rogues are pretty well known for being really flexible with their playstyle, and this just enhances that even further. So it's really only a good thing. So let's go ahead and talk about it. What is an Avenger? What makes the Avenger the Avenger? What are the changes? So first of all, you must choose a deity to be a follower of, and that is implied that you have to follow the edicts and anathema of them, but none of your abilities are tied to following their edicts and anathema. So I don't know why it really matters all too much, but thematically, you need to choose a god to follow. And then your skills have been changed, and we actually get less skills with the Avenger, which is very interesting. So the Avenger must be trained in intimidation, religion, and stealth, plus the divine skill associated with their god, and then an additional number of skills equal to 3 plus their intelligence. Now, before or base rogue, it's your stealth plus your racket plus 7 plus intelligence modifier. For a, minimum with 0 intelligence modifier of 9 versus what Avenger currently has, which is 7. Very interesting. Not that big of a deal. Honestly, I know a lot of rogue players who just don't know what they want to put their extra trained proficiencies in, and so they decide to just put it in whatever and kind of forget about it. But, it's something worth mentioning. You must also choose the Avenger racket, a unique racket that is only available to Avengers, and they must select it. And you also get the Hunt Prey action, which is very interesting, giving you some bonuses to tracking your prey, whomever that may be. Also giving you, or ignoring the first range increments of whatever range weapon you're using against your hunted prey, which is potentially interesting. Not necessarily a lot of the points of this particular racket, but still very interesting. So if you have like a thrown weapon, it can be really, really good, though we do lose the surprise attack feature of Rogue, which allows you to, whenever you roll either stealth or deception when you're starting or rolling for initiative, any enemies who have yet to go are considered off guard to you. A powerful feature, but honestly not one that I'm too particular about, especially because, in all honesty, speaking about initiative, unless you're really, really focusing on something like always stealthing before combat, which is just not always a thing you can do, you just kind of go whatever. And depending on what you roll on the D20, I mean, it's a D20. It can make a big difference. So maybe a few foes. If there's a lot of weaker enemies, it was really, really nice, though. So I won't say it's a bad feature. It's really good. It's just not one I would particularly miss all that much. In addition to the racket, which we'll get to here in a moment, we have additional feats that we now have access to, in addition to the archetype feats, and some new feats for rogues in general. But the additional feats that we get are pretty much all from Ranger. We get Twin Takedown, Twin Parry, Twin Riposte, Second Sting, and improved Twin Riposte. So as we can see here, a lot of the intent with the Avenger is you're wielding whatever your god's weapon is in one hand, and then you're wielding like a dagger or something in your other hand to get, a lot of your sneak attack damage off as long as the enemy is off guard. And if we're being real honest here, there's like a million ways to make enemies off guard in the game nowadays. So it's really easy for rogues to get their sneak attack off. And the fact that we can do it with whatever deific weapon we have is really cool. And the fact that we use Hunt Prey to essentially use things like Twin Strike means we have a lot of damage efficiency with weapons that we normally wouldn't be able to use as a rogue. It's a very combat savvy rogue racket, which I think is very interesting. And thus, I think it's pretty good. I think it's really interesting. And I can't really speak as to like how good. I haven't looked at all the weapons, done all the math and everything like that. But I know a lot of people online are already kind of like perusing through the Avenger. So we'll see what the theory crafters come up with in a month or so. But I guarantee there's probably some really wonky stuff in there that people are going to be able to utilize. Yeah, that's the word I'll use. So yeah, very, very interesting. But let's take a look at the racket itself. So for the racket, you are trained automatically in your god's divine skill, though if you would already be trained in it, since it might be something like stealth or intimidation, then you just become trained in another skill of your choice. So we don't really lose anything if we happen to double up on our skills. Nothing lost, but pretty good. And as I mentioned before, we are trained in our deity's favored weapon, and anytime our weapon proficiency would go up standardly, it would also go up for that weapon, whether it would be a weapon we'd normally have proficiency for or not, making it particularly good for the very few gods out there that have maybe some advanced weapons that rogues typically wouldn't be able to get trained proficiency in. Now, there is a bit of an error here. It says you can deal sneak attack damage with your deific weapon, just like any other weapon that you normally would be able to sneak attack with, but that's actually not the intent. There was an errata that kind of came out even before the book released. I actually received it pretty early, but it states here, I'll show you real quick, that they need to be your hunted prey. So they need to be your hunted prey if the weapon wouldn't normally give you sneak attacks. So many of the deific weapons do have either finesse or agile, which is pretty good, but not all of them. So they do need to be your hunted prey, adding a little bit of a action economy to our to a character class that doesn't necessarily have too much going on. I mean, maybe if you're trying to do the stealth hide attack method, but honestly, as I said, there's so many ways to make enemies off guard. I think if you have a team with even a modicum of teamwork, you're going to be able to get this feature off without too much issue. So one action per enemy that you plan on hunting during a fight, I don't think is actually too bad, especially because there are some pretty beefy weapons included in Deity's favored weapons that would be amazing to get sneak attack with. So I think this is overall a really strong feature. And speaking on striking enemies while off guard with our favored weapon, whenever we critically do so, we get our weapon's crit specialization. That's kind of like a lot to put on it, and there's a lot of weapons that really just don't have very interesting crit specializations. At least in my opinion, crit specializations are one of those things that, like, they're nice, but I don't really care about them all too often. So it's extra for sure, but it's okay. I think it's interesting. It's just, it not only does it have to be a crit, but they have to be off guard as well. Granted, making them off guard does make them more likely to be crit. So a nice feature overall, and makes our weapons particularly more deadly, kind of. And I guess I should have mentioned this earlier, but we can actually make strength our key ability modifier. Rogue, being the chameleon class that it is, can pretty much use anything for its key ability modifier besides constitution. And strength makes sense. There's a lot of deific weapons out there that are not finesse weapons. So being able to make it strength our key ability score is really good. And that strength is actually particularly handy because we also just get medium armor proficiency that ups at the same rate that our light armor proficiency does, meaning that having less dex isn't necessarily going to screw us over. because now we can just wear slightly bigger armor that doesn't have as high of a dex cap. So I'm pretty sure the optimal way to play Avenger is to have a pretty good one-handed deific weapon with like a nice offhand weapon that can just normally sneak attack. And then whenever you get the opportunity, you just hunt prey, use your deific weapon, and then your other weapon with the many ranger feats that we have access to. And with medium armor proficiency, we can kind of stick more in the thick of combat. So even the extra action that we're losing from hunt prey is not something like if you're a skirmish style rogue player, you don't have to worry about skirmishing anymore. We have to go kind of in and out of combat to avoid enemies just walloping on you. Well, at least you probably still should do that to some degree. It depends on the situation. But now we just don't have to rely on our decks quite so much. Though that does make our reflex saves more of a vulnerability. So something to consider for sure. But yeah, so overall, the Avenger Racket is kind of just a more bruisery rogue that has a list of interesting weapons that it can utilize. It definitely is going to be very interesting. And like I said, there's probably some wonky stuff out there that has yet to be theory crafted. That's going to make the Avenger probably a very fun class to play. So, keep your ears out. I definitely think there's going to be a fun one out there. So now moving on to the feats. As you know, or if you don't know, any class archetype requires one, that you select the class archetype at level 1 so that you can change your class features appropriately, and 2, you must select their dedication feat at level 2. And I should mention, being an archetype in general, you do need to select at least 2 more feats beyond the dedication if you want to select another archetype dedication outside of your class archetype. So there is a little bit of an investment, though I do say thanks to the many ranger feats that we get access to from just selecting this particular class archetype, I don't think there's that big of a need, but some people are going to complain about it, so I figured I'd make mention. But anyway, going on to the dedication itself, it gives us a +1 status bonus to saves against divine spells and any effects that deal spirit damage. In addition, we can use religion to gather information, coerce, or track as long as we are in a town or city, or probably within their vicinities, with a church dedicated to our deity, extracting any clues from the faithful by displays of our piety. So this is very similar to Vindicator, though slightly different. This is just kind of an additional feature added on, and honestly, I think it's pretty okay. It does mean that if you do select a much more lesser known god, less used god, it might not get used, but at the same time, many of the major cities in the setting of Galarian anyway have a Church of All Gods where your god is probably somewhat present. So that being said, it's not that big of a deal, but it is pretty interesting, and the just additional resistance to saves and spirit damage, not resistance, bonus to our saves against such effects is a nice little topper for a dedication feat. But honestly, amongst the class archetype dedication feats, it's not super interesting if you ask me personally. But, we got a bunch of cool features, and we completely changed our class for it, so it's a pretty small price to pay. There's actually not a lot of low-level feats. Well, level 4 feats, there are none except for what we get from Ranger. So next up, we have Zealous Inevitability. This is actually very interesting. It's a unique strike action that when we strike with our deific weapon and hit, the enemy gains the doomed condition. And every time we do this, the doomed condition increases. Now, you might be saying, hey, BLG, that's bad. There's no point to that other than the fact that, most enemies don't get death saving throws anyway. Well, you probably don't know, but most enemies that become doomed 4 just die immediately. And that's actually no different here. Though, when we do strike an enemy and they would become doomed 4, they do get a chance to roll a will save against our class DC, which isn't bad because it's based on our strength, essentially, which is probably a stat we're going to be focusing on, or dex if we were using a deific weapon that has a finesse tag on it. So we're in a pretty solid state, and, even if they succeed, they've only staved off death for one more strike. How many saves can they really make? Though this does gain the incapacitation trait only when the shot would kill. So while we can make the boss doomed, we can't really kill a boss necessarily. Again, that's not likely to happen. And so against boss enemies, this kind of doesn't do a whole bunch, but we actually do make use of the doomed condition for some of our other features. So Zealous inevitability, I think, is genuinely an interesting feat that allows us to be a really solid mook killer, especially if we're dealing with like low level enemies that are just really beefy, have lots of hit points, something like a troll or something. So it makes us really easy to kill low level enemies, though it's not necessarily a boss killer, which again, being a divine assassin, that feels like that should be the point. Regardless, I think it's pretty good. And like I said, we're going to be able to make use of that doomed condition a little bit later. So I think this feature could have been the level 4, if I'm going to be 100% honest. That would have felt like a better setup, but a lot of the later feats are higher level yet. So I guess this just is the place that it makes sense. It really doesn't matter all too much, but I figured I'd at least voice my opinions on that thought. Then we get Silence the Profane, a essentially reactive strike based on countering divine spells against any enemy within our reach or within the first range increment of our weapon. If we have a ranged deific weapon, we do need to be using our deity's favored weapon, and of course we need to make the strike with our deity's favored weapon. But if we do successfully strike an enemy who's attempting to cast a divine spell, and we successfully hit, the spell is immediately countered, and they're off guard for a round. Now, this is a very similar feature, again, to Vindicator. There's actually a lot of similarities between Avenger and Vindicator, but Vindicator is actually the better one, as it works for any spell casting, not just divine spells. Though the Vindicator version does not make the enemy off guard, while the Avenger one does. So for its extra specificity, the Avenger's Silence the Profane has a slightly better effect than what we got with the Vindicator. So honestly, this one is very campaign relevant. If you have a campaign that is using a lot of like evil divine people, cultists, that kind of stuff, then yeah, or even demons. A lot of demons use divine spells actually. So that would be probably the campaign to pick this up for. But if you're playing an Avenger in any other kind of game, this might be a pass, honestly speaking. So interesting to say the least. And the off guard condition is really good because now you can just sneak attack away on that enemy as much as you want. But it's very specific to divine spells. So very campaign reliant on its effectiveness. Then we have Shadow of Death. This is your classic kind of like Dead Man Tells No Tales kind of feature here in Pathfinder, where if we strike an enemy with our deific weapon when they're doomed, then our strikes gain the death trait, meaning that when they drop to 0 hit points, they just straight up die, which is usually the case, but not always technically the case. And then their body and soul are essentially silenced, so they can't be communicated, resurrected, or any of that, unless the resurrector or one who is attempting to communicate with the dead makes a counteract check against our class DC, or use an artifact, or are just a god, in which case there wouldn't have been anything we could have done to stop them anyway. Though, of course, it's only a counteract level at the level at which we killed the enemies. So, you know, it's an interesting feature. Again, very campaign reliant. There's not many situations I've seen in many campaigns where this comes up, but maybe you have a very wily DM who likes to have the big bad question his dead minions to get an idea of the party. So, might be interesting, but then what of the enemies you didn't kill personally? There's just a lot of loopholes in this particular one that I feel like doesn't make this a particularly good feat. It's very thematic, and I do like the narrative behind it, and I do think you could probably fabricate some situations where this might be useful, but it's very, very specific, and the kind of feat that I would only like retrain into and then retrain out of as soon as we're done with whatever the feature is. So definitely not a mainstay kind of feat I would find on most people's characters. And so it's kind of a meh feat. It's interesting. I like the assassin kind of idea of an assassin who kills you so hard that your ghost can't even speak about it. Like, that sounds really, really cool. It's just not super practical. And then we get the final Avenger feats, though we actually have a couple more feats to talk about after this one, so stay tuned. But we get Slay. I I don't like this feat name. I think there's just a lot of different ways that they could have done the feat. Like, so what does Slay do, right? Slay Queen, yes. I said it. Hopefully it's out of my system now. So it's a 2-action strike that we get to use on an enemy who is currently doomed 2 or greater. And honestly, this is the major reason why we want to build doomed on anyone anyway, which means that the whole point of Zealous inevitability is kind of not super useful until this point in the game. But we make a strike with any weapon. It doesn't even have to be our deity's favored weapon, which is pretty interesting. And if we hit, the target takes 4d6 extra precision damage with a basic fortitude saving throw against your class DC. Now, if the target critically fails this, they die. This is an incapacitation effect, so not good on bosses. And then the creature then becomes temporarily immune to your slay for 1 day. Now, the creature, I'm assuming it means here that they become immune to your slay for 1 day no matter what happens. But because it's kind of mentioned after the crit fail part, it feels like that's a part of the crit fail, which I don't think is the case. I think this is kind of just poorly worded here. It should say, regardless of the result of the check, the creature then becomes temporarily immune to slay for 1 day, because it would be very weird if you slayed the creature and then it became, or because they like crit failed, thus they died, and then they're immune, because it's like, okay, cool, whatever, I guess. That, unless resurrection is super duper common in the encounter, that seems a little redundant. So a little bit of bad wording here, if I'm going to be honest. Though the 4d6 extra precision damage does stack with our sneak attack, which is really, really cool. And so it's essentially a rogue's version of a 2-action power attack that we can use with our, our deity's favorite weapon, probably the better weapon, honestly, more often than not. But even like our side dagger or whatever offhand we're currently using to deal a lot of extra precision damage, which is pretty cool. Now, the enemy does have to be doomed too, but that's really easy for us to do on an enemy in a particular fight. And this just comes with a possible instant kill effect. Granted, because the fort save is a basic fort save, the 4d6 extra precision damage we're here are conditionally based on the result of that save. So if they crit fail, they actually technically take double damage, but if they succeed, they actually take half damage and then just become immune for a day. So Slay, I think, is okay. It's interesting. It's a nice little damage steroid strike that we could potentially make. And I do see a lot of uses for it. And the potential for the enemy to just die from the strike is pretty good. Plus, the enemy is already doomed to at this point and probably not a lot of HP left anyway. So it's a really nice, like, Hail Mary into an enemy who, worst case scenario, we just have to slay normally. So yeah, Slay's not bad. I think it's very interesting. It's a very interesting strike, though I don't think it's a particularly amazing strike. Not anything that I would necessarily say, everyone needs to pick Avengers so that you can get this feat in particular. So yeah, that's what the Avenger dedication gets. Though, as I mentioned before, there are 2 more feats that rogues get in general. But before we get to that, I need to make mention that if you're enjoying this content, leave a like. It really helps the channel out. But I'm also going to say, leave a like on other people's TTRPG content, especially for the War of Immortals stuff. War of Immortals was kind of a underappreciated book by, I feel like, a lot of people. And a lot of content creators really didn't get a lot of views. So those likes really help us, feel motivated, because we got a big book release that just, it feels like it fell flat a little bit, at least view-wise. And so that would really help. But also, TTRPG content's really important to me. And I would like it to be more important to more people. And the only way we're going to make that happen is by more people learning about tabletop. So leave a like on anyone's video that you're particularly enjoying, like mine. But that being said, let's go ahead and finish off this video so we can all carry on with our merry way for the day. Now, for these additional feats, it does mention that they are kind of intended for Avenger, but they are not exclusive to Avenger, so any rogue can pick these up, and I do think they're really good. So first of all, we get a stance, which is really cool, called the Haft Striker stance. Now, this is a rogue stance that allows you to, whenever you're wielding a two-handed weapon that is either in the hammer, spear, or polearm groups, not a bad number of ranges, and it makes me think of like a dwarf hammer build, which could be really cool. But it allows you to treat the haft of the weapon as a secondary additional weapon that does a D4 bludgeoning damage. The haft is also in the club group and has the agile and finesse traits, allowing you to backstab or a sneak attack with it, which is really good. Makes it particularly good on the Avenger because they probably have a favored weapon in one of these groups, allowing them to have essentially the ability to use all those ranger feats that I mentioned before that require two weapons. And in fact, that's the whole point of the stance, is it allows you to use any kind of features that require you to be using two weapons, ignoring the fact that you're wielding a two-handed weapon, though you do lose the ability to use two-handed weapon features that require you to be using two-handed weapons. Now, any runes you have on your weapon are also applied to the haft, which makes a bunch of sense, though only runes that would apply to a weapon type of, the haft, a little club weapon, essentially apply. It's a really interesting feat. I think there's some really cool things that can be done with this, and honestly, I do think that this is a really fun reason to go multi-class archetype into Rogue to pick this up for another class, because there might be a really good fighter build here, actually, which I think is super cool. So like imagine double slice maybe. And to make this even better, we get a level 10 feat called Haft Beatdown. That's a 3-action quadruple strike. Really, really interesting. So you can only use this once per minute, or, more often than not, once per combat. And of course, you must be in the Haft Striker stance. But essentially, you make a strike with your weapon using both ends, and you don't apply the multi-attack penalty until after the first 2 strikes are done. And then you strike again using the weapon and its haft for a total of 4 strikes, though those last 2 strikes are at your maximum multi-attack penalty. So I do think this one's very interesting. It's 3 actions for 4 strikes, the first 2 of which are probably going to be at your max ability to hit, and then the last 2 at your max map penalty, which is really interesting. And the haft end has the agile trait, so at least it's not that big of a penalty, at least on the haft strike. I think this one's interesting. I think it's really good on a rogue, because if you're in sneak attack position anyway and you're making a bunch of attacks, it's really good, honestly. So yeah, the Avenger dedication brought some very interesting things to the table. It opened up the number of weapons we could potentially use with the rogue. It makes for a more bruisery style of rogue with a little bit of religious undertones, so cue the pipe organ music. And then we got some interesting two-handed kind of multi-attack based feats with the haft based feats. So I think that overall this is a very interesting archetype, and while it's not one I'm particularly excited for myself, I'm also not an avid rogue player and haven't been interested in playing rogue at all. So, that's just my opinion. I think a lot of people are really interested in this one in particular, and some people are going to complain about the hunt prey aspect. Let me tell you, Rangers kick a bunch of ass and they use hunt prey all the time anyway, so this is really no different. And the fact that we get to use some really cool deific weapons with it is, honestly, like I said, there's probably some wonky stuff out there that's going to make this particular archetype really, really strong. So yeah, I think the Avenger is really cool, and the additional feats I think are also really interesting, and something I want to kind of see a little bit more of, this kind of idea of kind of changing how you use a weapon to use it in different ways so it can benefit from different kinds of feats. I think that's super cool. But that's going to be it, and that's kind of it for at least my direct coverage of War of Immortals. I'm going to start kind of intermixing some other content until We get to Divine Mysteries later this month, so if you want to see that content early, leave subscribe. But yeah, I overall I think the book was really good. I think we just released so many different Paizo released so many different books this year that we're kind of getting a little bit of book fatigue. A lot of people just don't have the money to buy a bunch of rule books every year. And this year in particular was just very heavy. Next year will be a much more regular year. And I'm always happy to see new classes. In fact, with the new classes added to the book, I'm going to be doing another class tier list here in a little bit. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a very interesting video, very long video probably, as I have, 25 classes to talk about now. Oof, that's a lot. But hopefully y'all enjoy. Thank y'all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.